my name is Sir Lord, and today we're going to be talking about movies. So, yesterday in our Let's Talk About, we talked about entertainment as a whole, but today I want to talk about not even specifically movies. I want to talk about score, so music, when in relation to media, film, video games, etc., and how exactly that impacts the medium it is representing. So, for instance, Star Wars, let's go with that, is one of the most popular or instantly recognizable soundtracks of all time. Like, there's no questioning that. There's a bunch of these kind of movies. We got Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, just classic soundtracks that, like, no matter what, you can recognize it. Indiana Jones is another one of them. Like, you hear these songs and you just immediately are like, oh, it's this. But I want to get into the how does a score affect a film in terms of people and how they feel about it. So, for instance, with Star Wars, right? Does the score directly impact how people feel about said movie? Like, does John Williams score or music, or like Duel of the Fates, for instance, make something seem better than it actually is? Now, I know that's a dicey topic because how can something be, like, you can't really quantify how good something is. You can say whether or not it's good or bad, but there's no real quantifying good. That's going to be up to you as a matter of perspective. That's kind of why when you're critiquing anything, you kind of, it is your score, not anyone else's score, and using that as like a basis for like general good is not exactly indicative of how good something may or may not be. And I'm just wondering whether or not it can bump up a movie like to critical acclaim, maybe not critical acclaim, but fan base, or like higher scores on Rotten Tomatoes and whatnot. General audience scores is more what I'm talking about. Like, can the music affect people in such a way that it will bolster or hinder a movie based on just the music alone? Because if you have like a movie that has like a soundtrack that is like amazing, phenomenal soundtrack, like, I guarantee you it could probably make some people just love the movie. It's very good at getting people into the mood, into the theme, into, it's good at making people feel the emotions that it needs to empower the rest of the movie to carry out whatever it's supposed to. For instance, like Into the Spider-Verse, for instance, phenomenal movie, right? But the soundtrack accompanies the film itself to such a perfect degree that it kind of engulfs you and like makes you really invested in whatever emotions are going on. So you like, Miles is freaking out. It's or is freaking out, running away, scared. It's very tense, right? And the music conveys that in a very direct way. Like, it's very linked to the movie, like quite directly linked. But then you can have other movies that may have amazing soundtracks, but it doesn't quite match the theme of the movie. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. And I think that's kind of like the downside with that, right? Is like you can have an amazing soundtrack. Oh, actually, not a movie. Tsubasa Chronicles. It's some anime. Don't watch it. It's garbage. But the soundtrack is amazing. And it can't save the rest of the show, right? Like, the soundtrack is on point, the music's like the best part of the show. The visuals are pretty good, except they linger on frames for too long. But the soundtrack, it just carries that show so hard. While the rest of the story, the plot, the framing, the pacing is just atrocious. But the music, that alone takes it from probably like a 4 to about a 5 or 6 for me. It's the whole reason I watched the show was just to listen to more of the music. But it wasn't always the best at conveying whatever emotions needed to be had. It was just a banging soundtrack. So is that something that like can kind of lead to someone not being invested in the film? Like if the soundtrack just doesn't line up with the film, does it take away from the film and make the rest of the film just seem not as good as the soundtrack? And then we also have the example of like the music and the film like are equal parts good, but they don't really mix very well. Like you could have a very uplifting, hopeful soundtrack, but you're in a tragedy, for instance. That might not be the best because maybe that could work, but you get the idea. Like the conflicting soundtrack to the movie can kind of like take away the win or the appeal of the movie. It can work against it. I know that can be said about most aspects of movies, but I honestly do believe that the soundtrack can is like the most impactful for general audiences, because if the music is very good about getting people invested in the movie, once they're invested and they're not looking at all the extra plot contrivances or plot devices and stuff like that, like when they're invested, they're engrossed, they're more willing to look past a lot of the like smaller nitpicky details that some movies like falter for. Now, I'm not saying that it completely exempts them, but it definitely helps. For instance, in Star Wars: The Force Awakens, awesome soundtrack, like John Williams, legendary composer for a reason, but I kind of feel like the movie itself isn't there. And this isn't even counting like episode 8 or 9. I'm just talking about 7 itself. The music, awesome, but it just doesn't feel right with the rest of the movie, right? Like I don't feel like a lot of these like really high musical notes or like these very hopeful or triumphant themes are like deserved or put in the right places with the movie. That's my own personal take. You can like the movie, you can hate the movie. It doesn't matter. But the point is that the movie itself just kind of folds in on itself when it comes to the music, and I feel like a lot of shows can do that where or it doesn't fold into itself. The music tries to carry the movie to a higher degree than it otherwise should be. Uh, So I'm just curious as to what your guys' opinions are. If you even listen to this, there's probably like nobody listening to this. But just in case you do listen to this, just let me know in the comments below. Like, what do you think of the score and how does that properly affect a film? And if you want, just leave an example of like maybe a score that you think helps the film a lot, or a film that like has a really bad score, even though the film itself is fine. I can't think of too many of those off the top of my head. It's kind of hard to. Oh, actually, I can think of one of those. So, in Book of Life, their soundtrack sucks. Oh my gosh, like all of the songs. Okay, the soundtrack itself isn't bad. Any of the songs that are remixed from pop culture songs, like popular songs, are so bad. Like, they are atrocious. There's like one good song in the whole movie from like the sing song part. And that's when he's taming the bull, I think. Yeah, when he's taming the bull at the end. Like, oh my gosh. That movie soundtrack or songs are abysmal, and they're easily the worst parts of the movie, and it's infuriating because that movie has some issues, but I really like that movie still. But the soundtrack itself is like one of the worst parts, and it just brings it down for me. So I guess that would be a movie that's soundtrack kind of fails it. But if you have other examples, just let me know in the comments below, and let's have a discussion. Let's talk about it. Well, I'll see you guys in the next one.